On the coldest night of December 2021, in a snow-covered valley east of Alaska's Kenai mountains, a white wolf wrapped its huge bulk around a shivering youngster. The boy was 11. He hadn't spoken for 4 years. He didn't cry, ask for aid, or scream into the darkness like any other lost child might. He merely pressed his small hands into the wolf's fur and closed his eyes. And the wolf, a wild, untamed creature that had never been touched by a person before, remained still. It lowered its head, pushed its nose to the boy's chest, and listened for his heartbeat. The boy was still alive when rescue helicopters found them 4 days later. The wolf was still present. And what happened next was broadcast on every news channel in the country because no one believed what they heard. If stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing. This channel exists to tell stories that should be remembered. But before we get to that point, before the howl, before the cameras, before the tears, you should know who Ethan Mercer was. And, most crucially, who he used to be. Ethan Mercer used to babble non-stop. His mother, Sarah, used to make a joke about it. The boy came out of the womb with an opinion, she'd tell friends at dinner gatherings, shaking her head with the tired pride that only a parent knows. And it was true. By the age of 3, Ethan could identify every bird in the garden feeder. By 4, he was reciting facts about Arctic animals to anyone who would listen, including cashiers, mailmen, and strangers at the grocery store. He'd tug on their sleeves, his eyes wide, and launch into a frenzied speech about how wolves could hear sounds from 6 miles away, how their paws had specific blood arteries that kept them warm on ice, and how a pack could walk 30 miles in a single day without rest. Everyone smiled. Some people listened, most did not. But David Mercer, Ethan's father, always did. David was a wildlife photographer, not the kind who shoots beautiful magazine covers from helicopters, but the kind who lies face down in cold muck for 11 hours to get a single shot of a lynx at dawn. He was 42 years old, wiry, and patient in the way that only a man who had spent years waiting for animals to trust him can be. And when Ethan mentioned wolves, which he did frequently, David did more than just listen. He leaned in. He asked queries. He took out his old field notes and showed his son sketches of wolf tracks he'd sketched in places few people would ever see. The evenings were everything. Father and kid sat side by side on the living room floor, surrounded by maps, nature books, and half-eaten sandwiches, which Sarah discovered hours later. Ethan would trace his finger across mountain ranges and murmur the names of rivers as if they were sacred. David would watch him and feel something tighten in his chest. Not worry, not yet. Just the quiet, crushing weight of loving someone so deeply that the prospect of anything going wrong seemed inconceivable. But something went wrong. It occurred 3 months after Ethan's 7th birthday. The school had scheduled a winter assembly with 200 students jammed into a gymnasium, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and a sound system turned to full volume. For most kids, it was just another raucous afternoon. Ethan's world has come to an end. The truth later emerged from information gathered from teacher notes and therapy sessions. First, the sounds affected her. Not like noise that most people perceive and try to ignore, or like background noise, but like a wall. The reality was an overwhelming wall of sound hitting her brain from every angle. Then the lights appeared, flickering, sharp, and relentless. Then the crowd came. Bodies were everywhere, elbows, shoulders, and jaws. The whole body was moving very quickly and excessively. Ethan's hands moved to his ears. His eyes were clenched tight. His body became tight, with every muscle contracting simultaneously, as if his own skin had become a cage. The teachers did not understand. One of them grabbed his arm and led him out. Something broke as a result of the quick, unexpected, and uninvited touch. Ethan yelled, not in words, not a cry for aid. A savage, feral sound ripped through the gymnasium, silencing 200 children in an instant. He fell to the floor, curled into himself, and shook uncontrollably for 45 minutes. Sarah came to find her kid sitting in the nurse's office, staring at the wall, silent, complete and absolute silence. He did not speak on the way home. He didn't speak during dinner. He didn't say anything when David sat alongside him that night and carefully opened their favorite book, The Wolves of Denali, and read aloud like he always did, pausing at the points where Ethan typically joined in with his own facts. The intervals lengthened into quiet. The quiet lasted for days. The days turned into weeks. Ethan Mercer never spoke again, not for his parents, not to mention the parade of professionals, speech therapists, child psychologists, neurologists, and behavioral experts, who walked past their living room for the next 4 years like tourists passing through a town they couldn't solve. Not to the other students at his new school, a small private program for children on the autism spectrum, where the teachers were gentle, the classrooms were quiet, and nothing was supposed to go wrong. Sarah tried everything: sign language, picture cards, communication tablets, music therapy, animal-assisted treatment, involved gentle golden retrievers nudging Ethan's hand and waiting for a response that never came. She read every book, joined every support group, stayed up past midnight researching new techniques till her eyes burned, and David discovered her asleep at the kitchen table, laptop still shining, search bar still open. How to help a nonverbal autistic child speak again. David handled things differently. He didn't do any research. He just observed. He sat with his child in long silences. Not the kind that would cause most people to fidget and fill the space with noise, but the kind of silence that settles between two people who don't need words to be in the same space. David understood the concept of silence. He had spent much of his life lying on the ground in cold environments, waiting for wild animals to appear. He understood that silence wasn't empty, it was filled, full of listening, presence, and things that words could only spoil. And he spotted something that the specialists did not. Ethan was still conversing, not with humans, with animals. At the park, Ethan would sit immobile on a seat until the birds got close enough to land on the armrest next to him. At the zoo, he'd press his forehead against the glass of the wolf exhibit for hours, his breath fogging the surface and his fingers tracing the shape of the wolves as they moved. When David was shooting a magazine assignment at a natural reserve outside Anchorage, a fox approached Ethan and sat down at his feet. The handler claimed he had never seen anything like it. The fox stayed for 20 minutes. Ethan never moved, but David noticed it, a change in his son's expression. Not a smile exactly, somewhat softer, something deeper, something that resembled peace. That's when the notion took hold. David had been offered a 3-week winter shoot on Alaska's Kenai Peninsula, documenting wolverine activity in sub-zero temperatures. The salary was decent, the place was distant. Sarah had already declined twice. "He needs routine, David," she remarked, arms crossed at the kitchen doorway. "He needs his timetable, his school, his therapists. He needs the wild," David explained quietly. Sarah opened her mouth. "I closed it. I opened it again. You don't know that." "No," David replied, "but I understand what I see. Sarah, he doesn't connect with people. He interacts with animals, and we are running out of things to try." The argument lasted 3 days. It was quiet, as conflicts in the Mercer house often were. No screaming voices, just long pauses, cautious words and unfinished phrases. Sarah felt afraid. Not from Alaska. Of hope. She'd been burnt far too many times by new therapies, new specialists, and new approaches that promised a breakthrough but delivered nothing but another locked door. But something in David's voice that final evening, not assurance or certainty, but a raw, desperate kind of faith, compelled her to say yes. They left on December 14th. The cottage David had reserved was 40 miles south of Soldotna, accessible only by a single gravel road that had vanished beneath snow by mid-November. It was small, 2 rooms, a wood stove, no mobile signal, and sat at the edge of a spruce forest that went unbroken to the mountains. The nearest neighbor was 11 miles distant. The nearest town is 23 years old. Sarah immediately refused. but Ethan got out of the truck and stood there as if frozen. He stood motionless in the snow that came up to his knees, his red jacket contrasting sharply with the white. His eyes, wide, black and unreadable, searched the tree line carefully from left to right, as if reading something written in the branches. His breath formed whitish clouds. His hands hung loosely at his sides, and, for the first time in as long as David could remember, his son's shoulders were relaxed. David watched from the truck, his throat clenched. "Sarah," he whispered. She was alongside him. She also saw it. Ethan Mercer was listening. Not for them, not to the wind, the trees, or the crunch of snow on his boots. He was listening to something deeper, something that pulsed beneath the silence of that freezing valley, something no machine or therapist could quantify. And somewhere out there, beyond the black wall of spruce, past the frozen creek, the snow-covered ridgeline, and the huge, indifferent wilderness that swallowed sound like the ocean swallows stones, a wolf was also listening. Nobody expected what happened 3 days later, and the true story had only barely begun. The first 2 days at the cottage were the most peaceful David and Sarah had experienced since Ethan's diagnosis. Not the heavy quiet of their home in Anchorage, the kind that sat on your chest and reminded you of everything that was missing, but a different kind, quiet living, the sort that breathes. Ethan awoke before daylight both mornings. David would discover him already clothed, standing at the cabin's wharf, single front window, hands flat against the cold glass, watching the tree line like a sailor studies the horizon. Not restless. I am not anxious. Waiting. On the first morning, David attempted to coax him to the breakfast table. Ethan didn't resist. He never resisted, fought, or made things difficult in the ways that parenting books warned about, but his gaze remained fixed on the window even as he chewed his toast, and Sarah wiped a crumb from his chin with the gentle, automatic tenderness of a mother who has learned to love without expecting anything in return. After breakfast, David put Ethan in his heaviest coat, buckled his boots, and led him outside. The cold struck immediately. Not the cold they were used to in Anchorage, which was manageable and civilized thanks to buildings, vehicle heaters, and heated sidewalks, but the raw, unfiltered cold of the wilderness, the sort that found the spaces between your collar and your neck, transformed your breath into crystals before. It left your lips and caused the inside of your nose to crackle with each inhalation. The thermometer fastened to the porch post read 22 degrees below zero. Ethan did not flinch. He stepped directly off the porch and into the snow. It rose up to his knees, but he plowed through at a steady, deliberate speed that shocked David. The boy proceeded toward the tree line, not rushing or wandering, but with purpose, as if someone had called his name from beyond the spruce wall and he was just responding. David followed. His camera bag rested on his shoulder, but he didn't reach for it. This was not a shoot. This was something very different. They walked for about an hour on average. Ethan was ahead, David following him. The forest narrowed further as the spruce and birch trees closed in on the canopies, transforming the pale morning light into narrow, shimmering beams that cut across the treetops like spotlights. The only sounds were the squeaking of their boots on the snow and the unexpected cracking of a branch somewhere deep in the woods, like something bone-like breaking. Ethan paused. David came quite close to colliding with him. The boy stood at the edge of a little clearing, perhaps 30 feet wide, surrounded by old-growth spruce, the snow in the center untouched and smooth as a blank page. Ethan's gaze was focused on something in the snow. David looked down. Tracks, large tracks, canine, but larger than any dog, 4 toes, claws extended, pushed deeply into the snow in a straight, intentional path that traversed the clearing diagonally before disappearing into the far tree line. David's breath caught. Wolf tracks, fresh, maybe it's an hour old. He knelt beside them, muscle memory taking over, photographer instincts documenting the size, depth, and spacing. A huge mammal, moving at a steady trot. There are no evidence of a pack, only a single set of prints. A lone wolf. When he looked up, Ethan was also kneeling, the boy's bare fingertips. He'd removed his gloves at some point, and David hadn't noticed, traced the edge of one track with the regard reserved for sacred objects. His touch was feathery light, careful, as if the track were alive and he didn't want to disturb it. Something moved in David's chest. He'd spent 20 years photographing wild creatures. He had witnessed grizzlies charging, eagles diving, and caribou herds thundering across the tundra like rivers of bone and fur. But he had never seen anything stare at a wolf track like his son was doing now. Not for curiosity, not fascinated, recognition, as if Ethan knew the animal that had created it. They returned to their cabin before midday. Ethan ate lunch without issue, and then sat by the window again to watch. Sarah caught David in the tiny hallway that connects the bedroom and the kitchen, her voice low. "He seems different." David nodded. "He found wolf tracks this morning." Sarah's expression changed, not to alarm, but close enough. After 4 years of disappointment, the woman expressed skepticism towards any signs of development. "Don't read too much into it," she said. "I'm not." But he was. He couldn't help it, because for the first time in years, his son had taken him anywhere, had walked through the world with purpose, direction, and something that seemed dangerously near to yearning. And David Mercer, a man who had earned a living by being patient, waiting, and trusting in the slow unfolding of events, felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. The second day followed a similar pattern. Awake before morning. Window, breakfast, walk. But this time, Ethan went further. They crossed the clearing with the wolf tracks. A new set now. Same size, same direction, same lone animal. And pushed deeper into the forest. Past the frozen creek bed David had noted on his survey map. Past a stand of dead birch trees, stripped white by wind and weather. And into a section of old-growth spruce, so dense that the canopy blocked out the sky. The air seemed cooler, motionless, and almost pressured, as if the forest was holding its breath. Ethan came to a halt at the base of a massive spruce with a trunk broader than David's arm span, age-scarred bark, and ice-covered lower branches. The boy sat down in the snow near the roots, bringing his knees to his chest and closing his eyes. David waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15. Ethan did not move. His breathing slowed. The strain that resided permanently in his small body, the tightness in his jaw, the rigid set of his spine, the way his fingers curled into his palms even while sleeping, began to dissipate gradually. His shoulders slumped, his hands opened, palms up, and rested on his knees. And then something happened, which David would later struggle to explain to the search and rescue crew, reporters, and anyone else who asked. A sound emerged from the forest. Not close, maybe a mile away, maybe more. Distance was difficult to determine in this country, where sound bounced off mountains and traveled through valleys in ways that made your ears lie to you. But it was undeniable. A howl. Long, low, rising and falling in a long, melancholy arc that seemed to linger in the icy air even after it ended, like the final note of a song the forest was scared to forget. David froze. Every nerve in his body fired simultaneously. He'd heard wolves before, through camera blinds, over rivers, from the protection of elevated hides, but never so near, so raw, and with no barrier between him and the sound. His hand instantly moved to Ethan's shoulder, prepared to pull him up and move. But Ethan had already reacted. Not with terror, not with the rigid, shut-down response that loud or unexpected sounds typically elicit. The boy's eyelids opened slowly, as if he were waking from a dream he didn't want to end. His head slanted to the left, the identical move David had seen 1,000 times in wolves, the instinctual head tilt, used to determine the direction of a sound. Then Ethan did something he hadn't done since the age of 7. He opened his mouth. There was no sound coming out. His lips parted, his chest expanded, and his throat worked. David could see the muscles squeezing, his son's body attempting to produce something it had forgotten how to do. But the sound did not arrive. Not yet. The technology existed, but it had been dormant for so long, trapped behind such thick walls that even the most magnificent wolf's cry couldn't penetrate them in a single afternoon. Ethan closed his mouth. His eyes gleamed. David's heart broke. He drew his son to his chest and held him in the snow at the base of the ancient spruce tree, and neither of them moved for a long time. The cold did not matter. The assignment did not matter. It made little difference that the camera remained untouched in the backpack. Nothing mattered save the small heartbeat hammering against David's ribs and the echo of that cry still booming through the trees. That night, Ethan refused to leave the window. Sarah tried 3 times. Warm milk, his favorite blanket. The occupational therapist prescribed a weighted compression vest during instances of overstimulation. Nothing worked. Ethan sat with his forehead against the glass, wiping away his breath with his sleeve every few seconds. Sarah's gut knotted as she whimpered, "David," from the bedroom doorway. "He needs to sleep." David sat at the kitchen table with his field notebook open and pen in hand. He'd been writing, not for the assignment, but about Ethan. The tracks, the clearing, the howl, the instant his son opened his mouth. "He's waiting for it," David said. "For what?" "The wolf." Sarah looked at him. "You don't know that." David gazed at his wife. His eyes were crimson. He hadn't sobbed in front of her since the day Ethan was diagnosed, but he was getting close. He tried to howl Sarah. The stillness that followed those remarks filled the cabin like floodwaters. Sarah's hand moved to her mouth. She slumped into the chair across from David and did not speak. Could not speak, because she understood, as only a mother can, what those words meant. Her kid, who had not attempted a single vocalization in 4 years, had been tested by the greatest specialists in the state and had been categorized as selectively mute with no current indicators of verbal re-engagement. Had tried. Not for therapists, not for a communication device, not for her. For the wolf. She wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. She did both. At some time after midnight, Ethan fell asleep at the window, his breath slow and even against the glass. David brought him to bed, wrapped the covers around him, and stood in the doorway, gazing at his son's face. Serene, truly peaceful, in a way it hadn't been in years. Then he went back to the kitchen, sat down, and made his decision. He would extend the trip. 1 more week. Whatever it takes. He was about to reach for his satellite phone to message the magazine editor, when he was cut off by a sound. A howl. This time, we're closer, much closer, right at the tree line. David stepped to the window where Ethan had been seated. He pressed his face against the glass and cupped his hands about his eyes to obscure the reflection of the lamp behind him. The porch light produced a feeble yellow circle on the snow, providing about 20 feet of visibility before darkness enveloped everything. Beyond that, the spruce wall was a silent, impenetrable black mass. But something was standing on its edge. 2 points of light, low to the ground, amber, unblinking, eyes. David's heart stopped. Nobody could have guessed what would come next, because in less than 48 hours, those amber eyes would be the only thing standing between his son and the harshest wilderness on earth. The most surprising part hadn't happened yet. David did not sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table, all the lights in the cabin turned off, observing the tree line through the window where his kid had pressed his face just hours earlier. Seconds after David noticed them, the amber eyes disappeared. A slow blink, a shift in the darkness, and then nothingness, only darkness. The only thing separating the cabin from the woods was the dark fir wall and the pale strip of snow. But David knew what he had seen. After 20 years of fieldwork, he had learned to identify animals solely based on the spacing and height of their eyeshine. Coyote eyes sat close together, low and twitchy. Moose eyes were lofty, wide-set and dull green. Bear eyes reflected red and never remained motionless. The wolf eyes gleamed amber, steady, unblinking. Set at a height that made David realize this was no average wolf. This animal was enormous, potentially alpha class, and it had been standing at the edge of the tree line, watching the cabin with the calm stillness of a creature with nowhere else to go. A lone wolf. In December. This is close to a human habitation. That in itself was remarkable. Wolves, especially in the Kenai, avoided humans. They had learnt over generations of warfare that people meant noise, danger, and the sound of a rifle over a valley. A robust, well-fed wolf had no motive to approach the lodge. There's no reason to stand in the open and stare, unless that wasn't the cabin they were observing. David's gaze shifted to the hallway, where Ethan's bedroom door was slightly ajar, with a thin bar of moonlight falling over the floor inside. His son was sleeping, safe, breathing gently behind 3 layers of blankets. But the concept had embedded itself in David's mind like a splinter and refused to leave. The wolf was not watching the cabin, it was observing his son. The morning came gloomy and heavy. The sky had sealed itself overnight, forming a low, unbroken layer of cloud that pressed down on the mountains like a lid. David examined the thermometer on the porch. There are 31 listed below. The barometric pressure had decreased significantly. He recognized the indications. A storm was forming to the west, bringing frigid air down from the Arctic shelf. They had about a dozen hours until it hit. He decided to stay indoors. There is no walk today, no forest. He'd spend the day planning the extended journey, reviewing his maps and organizing his equipment. Ethan had different plans. The youngster stood at the window before David had finished his first cup of coffee, hands flat on the glass, his breath making the same little fog circle he'd wiped clean 100 times the previous night. His body was hard with concentration. Not the worried rigidity David expected, but the focused, coiled stillness of an animal that has detected a scent. "Not today, buddy," David replied kindly. "Storm approaching." Ethan did not turn, did not react. His gaze remained fixed on the forest line. Sarah exited the bedroom, slipping a sweater over her head. She stared at Ethan and then at David. Sarah came to the window and crouched alongside her kid. "He wants to go out," David replied. "In this?" I told him no. She gently placed her hand on his back, never with the full force that caused his muscles to clench, and followed his gaze to the trees. "What's he looking at?" David hesitated. He had not told Sarah about the eyes. He'd spent the dark hours debating whether to disclose it at all, whether the information would frighten her, or whether it would jeopardize the delicate, conditional consent she'd given for this journey to go. But David Mercer was not a man who kept secrets from his wife, not about their son. There was a wolf at the tree line last night. Sarah's hand stopped traveling across Ethan's back. How close? The edge of the porch light. Maybe 60 feet. David. Her voice sounded hollow, controlled. She adopted this voice to hide her fear. It left. I spent the next 2 hours watching the tree line. It did not come back. "We need to leave." "Sarah, we should leave today, before the storm." We packed the truck and drove back to Soldotna. He tried to wail. The words struck her like a hand on the chest. She stared at David, then to Ethan. "That wolf," David remarked gently. "Whatever it is, whatever's going on between it and Ethan, it prompted our son to speak. For the first time in 4 years. I am not leaving. Not yet." The dispute that followed was silence. It all happened in the space between their eyes, years of marriage compressed into a single glance that held dread, love, tiredness, and the awful, beautiful tenacity of 2 parents who would do anything for their child, but couldn't agree on what anything meant. Sarah averted her gaze. "One more day," she replied. "One, and you don't let him leave your sight." David nodded. "I won't." He intended it. David breached his pledge at 11:15 that morning. It was not dramatic. It was hardly a catastrophic error of judgment. It was the kind of modest, human, forgivable error that reshapes lives. the kind that repeats in a parent's head 10,000 times thereafter, each replay sharper than the last, and ending with the same whispered question. What if I had just stayed in the room? David needed to restart the generator. The cabin's wood stove provided heat, but the generator powered for water pump, a single overhead light in the kitchen, and, most importantly, the satellite phone charger. The phone was at 9%. David needed to call the magazine's editor. He needed to contact the supply pilot in Soldotna to prolong their food delivery. He wanted to check the weather service for the latest storm reports. The generator was located in a tiny shed adjacent to the back of the cabin, 15 feet from the back entrance. David could see both windows of the main room from the shed if he craned his neck. "Watch him," he instructed Sarah. "I'll be 2 minutes." Sarah was slicing bread on the kitchen counter. She nodded, but didn't look up. 2 minutes became 5. The generator was cold, the pull cord was stiff, and the fuel line was partially clogged, which David had to remove with numb fingers, blowing on his hands every few seconds and swearing under his breath. He began it on the 7th pull, checked output, confirmed that the phone was charging via the cabin wall outlet, and walked back inside. The kitchen was vacant. The bread was half sliced on the counter, the knife laid on its side. "Sarah?" Her voice emerged from the corridor, taut and high. "David?" He was next to her in 3 steps. Ethan's bedroom door was open. The window was open. Cold air surged through the opening like water through a dam's break, carrying the crisp, clear aroma of pine, as well as the distant, scarcely heard groan of wind gathering in the mountains. The bed was vacant. The boots beside the door were gone. The red jacket was gone. A single set of footsteps moving toward the tree line was visible in the snow beneath the window, small, deep, and unmistakable. Going right into the jungle. David could not move, couldn't breathe. 3 seconds. This is how long the paralysis lasted. 3 seconds that felt like 3 lifetimes, his body frozen, his mind racing with every worst-case scenario a father could think of. The cold, the wolves, the terrain, the approaching storm, his son, alone in a freezing wilderness that killed experienced adults. Then he moved. He took his thickest coat from the hanger near the entryway. He pulled on his boots. He went for the satellite phone and slipped it into his inner pocket. "Call search and rescue," he instructed Sarah. His voice remained steady. His hands weren't. "My phone is charging. Wait till it reaches 20%, then call. Tell them about an 11-year-old boy, nonverbal and autistic, wearing a red jacket and traveling north-northwest from the cabin into the Kenai bush. Give them our coordinates. They're written on the map taped to the fridge." Sarah's face was white, completely white, as if every drop of blood had drained from her body and accumulated someplace beneath the floorboards. Her mouth moved, but no sound emerged. David grabbed her shoulders, firm. "Keep it steady, Sarah. Look at me." She glanced and said, "I will find him." He did not wait for an answer. He was out the door and running before she could exhale, following the small footprints in the snow, watching them stretch ahead of him in a clean, straight line toward the trees, and concluding, absurdly, irrationally, but with absolute certainty, that those footprints did not look like the footprints of a lost boy. They resembled the tracks of a youngster who knew precisely where he was going. David sprinted to the tree line and plunged into the woodland. Behind him, the cabin dwindled into a golden spot. Ahead, the spruce closed in, the light darkened, the temperature dropped, and the footprints continued, deeper, farther, quicker than an 11-year-old should have been able to go through knee-high snow. Above the trees, the sky darkened. The storm was no longer 12 hours distant. It was here. The first flakes began to fall, not gently, not in the gentle, charming snowfall of Christmas cards, but harsh, angular, blown sideways by a wind that had arrived from nowhere and everywhere at once. Within minutes, David could only see 20 feet ahead. Within 10 minutes, the imprints had filled in. He was losing the track and cried, "Ethan!" His voice splintered against the wind and returned to him in fragments, broken and useless. "Ethan!" Nothing. It's just wind. just the hiss of snow on spruce needles and the deep, moaning creak of trees bowing beneath the weight of ice. David ran faster, his lungs burnt. The frigid air sliced through his throat like glass. He stumbled on a buried root, fell hard on one knee, pushed himself up, and continued moving. The footprints were fading, half-filled, quarter-filled, ghosts of impressions that would vanish in minutes. Then they were gone. David paused. His breath came in harsh, palpable blasts. He moved in a slow circle, inspecting the ground, the trees, and the white jumble of snow swirling about him. Nothing. The path has disappeared. His son's footprints, the only link between him and his child, had been removed by the storm as casually as a hand erasing chalk from a board. He was alone. His son was alone. Somewhere in this freezing, shrieking wilderness, an 11-year-old child was alone, unable to call for aid, tell anybody where he was, or even cry out in agony if he fell. David Mercer went to his knees in the snow and did something he hadn't done since he was a youngster. He prayed. Just as everything appeared to be fitting into place, fate wrecked it all in less than 5 minutes. And somewhere beyond the white wall, Ethan Mercer was heading farther into the storm. But he was not alone. Not yet. Because something with white fur and amber eyes had been watching the cabin since dawn, had followed the boy's scent from the moment his boots touched the snow beneath that open window, and was now moving through the blizzard with the silent, purposeful stride of a creature who knew these mountains as well as Ethan did the pages of his wolf books. The wolf found him, and what happened next would alter both of their lives forever. Ethan didn't realize he was lost. That was the one thing no one could understand afterward. Not the rescue crew, the psychologists, or the reporters who would later try to spin his story into something with a clear beginning, middle, and finish. Ethan Mercer had not gone into the forest in a condition of uncertainty or panic. He had not slept-walked. He hadn't been disoriented or scared, as many people imagined when they heard an autistic boy had vanished into the Alaskan tundra in December. He had followed the call. Just before 11 a.m., a single, low and lengthy wail pierced the cabin walls like a needle through cloth. His mom was in the kitchen. His father was outdoors. And Ethan heard it in the same way he heard everything the wolf made, as a sensation rather than a sound. A vibration began in his chest and spread outward through his ribs, arms and fingers, a frequency that perfectly matched something inside him, making ignoring it seem like holding his breath underwater. So he had gone to the window. I opened it, climbed out. The cold reached him quickly, but he scarcely noticed it. His boots found the snow and his body pushed forward, and the forest opened out for him in the same way it always did. Not scary, not hostile, but comforting. The spruce branches separated. The snow supported his weight in some places, but gave way in others, and he adjusted instinctively, much like water does to the contour of a riverbank. He wasn't navigating, he was following. Then the storm arrived, the howl faded, and the world turned white. Ethan stopped walking. He stood in a little hollow between two fallen trees, enormous trunks dragged down by a previous storm, crossed over each other like giants' bones, forming a shallow pocket of cover where the wind couldn't reach full strength. Snow had piled on the trunks in deep drifts, creating walls. A surviving spruce leaned over the breach, its branches heavy with ice, forming a makeshift ceiling. It was not warm, but it wasn't as cold. Ethan sat down. He brought his knees to his chest, tucked his hands into his sleeves, and rested his back on one of the fallen trunks. The bark was hard against his jacket. The snow beneath him compacted under his weight, becoming almost solid. His crimson clothing was the sole color in a world that had been stripped of all but white, gray, and the dark green-black of spruce needles. He was not afraid. Fear necessitated anticipation, the ability to look forward in time and envisage negative events. Ethan's mind did not function that way. He was in the present tense, experiencing the immediate sensory reality of chilly air on his face, snow under his legs, and the muffled roar of wind above the tree canopy. He didn't consider rescuing. He did not think about his parents. He didn't think about dying. He pondered about the howl. Where has it gone? It had been right there, a real living thing moving through the air towards him. And then the storm swallowed it, just as it consumed everything, leaving only white noise, the static hiss of a billion snowflakes clashing in midair, and Ethan alone with the quiet inside his own thoughts. He closes his eyes. Minutes passed, or in hours. Time had no edges amid the storm. It was a continuous, unbroken block of cold, sound and whiteness that stretched in every direction with no markers or intervals. Ethan's body temperature was lowering. His fingers, curled within his sleeves, had ceased aching, a warning sign he couldn't identify or understand, even if someone had described it to him. His breathing slowed. His heartbeat became softer. Suddenly, something warm pushed against his side. Ethan's eyes opened. The wolf was huge. That was his first realization. Not the hue, not the eyes, not the inconceivable truth of a wild predator rubbing its body against a human youngster in the middle of a blizzard, but the size. Even as it laid near Ethan, the animal's shoulder was level with his chest. Its body was a solid wall of dense, deep white fur that evolution had spent 10,000 years honing for this type of cold. Its paws were broader than Ethan's hands, and its dark claws lay on the snow with a softness that contradicted their size. The wolf's head turned, amber eyes, close enough to see the black rings surrounding the irises, close enough to see snowflakes caught in the muzzle's light fur. Ethan got close enough to feel the animal's breath, warm and steady, with the subtle mineral aroma of something wild and ancient, entirely different from the world he knew. The wolf gazed at him. Ethan gazed at the wolf. And something happened between them in that moment. Not language, not thought, nothing that could be measured, recorded, or explained using the clinical jargon of the specialists who had spent 4 years attempting to decipher the quiet within this boy's skull. It was older than the language, deeper than expected, a recognition that bypassed every broken circuit in Ethan's head and linked directly to something fundamental, something that existed before words, speech, and the human brain decided that communication required sounds arranged in a precise way. The wolf spotted the boy. The boy saw a wolf. Neither of them glanced away. Ethan's hand moved, slowly. Not the jerky, reflexive movements that characterized his responses to most stimuli, but a smooth, deliberate extension of his arm from inside his sleeve, fingers uncurling, palm turning upward, reaching for the wolf's neck with the same reverent touch he'd used on the track in the clearing 2 days before. His fingertips slipped into the fur, warm, impossibly warm, as if thrusting his hand into the sunlight made it solid. The fur was coarse on the outside, but dense and velvety underneath, with layers upon layers of insulation, trapping heat against the animal's skin. Underneath, he could feel the wolf's body, the hard architecture of muscle and bone, the slow expansion of ribs with each breath, and a deep, steady, and strong heartbeat. Ethan pushed closer. He turned his body into the wolf's side, his cheek on the thick fur of its shoulder, his little frame fitting into the curve of the animal's body like a stone into the riverbed it was designed for. The wolf did not flinch. I didn't feel tense. It moved its weight slightly, adjusting and accepting, before lowering its big head to rest on Ethan's knee. The wind shrieked above them. The thunderstorm raged. The temperature was plummeting to levels that would make the rescue squad shake their heads in bewilderment. But in that small niche between 2 fallen trees, snuggled against the body of a white wolf, Ethan Mercer felt warm. For the first time in 4 years, he felt right at home. The wolf remained. The wolf remained motionless all afternoon, while the storm raged and the light went from grey to charcoal to the pure black of an Alaskan winter night. Its body generated heat in the same way that a furnace does, consistently, radiantly, and effortlessly. Ethan's core temperature, which had been decreasing approaching the point where organs slow and shut down, stabilized. His fingers, which had been white and numb, gradually regained color. The shivering that had tortured his body in waves eventually receded, giving way to a deep, animal quiet that matched the wolf's. They breathed together. That was the toughest thing for David to accept when he eventually heard the whole story. Not that a wolf approached his son or stayed, but that their breathing coordinated. Enter through the nose, hold, and out through the mouth. The same rhythm, the same tempo. Their lungs seemed to have agreed on a frequency and locked into it, much like two pendulums put side by side eventually swing in unison. Ethan slept, not the fitful, surface-level sleep he managed at home, which was disrupted by dreams, sensory spikes, and a persistent, low-grade anxiety that pulsed through his nervous system like electrical noise. This was a deep one, oceanic. His body had been starved for sleep, which he had not been able to obtain in 4 years of weighted blankets, white noise generators, and precisely regulated surroundings built by doctors who knew everything about autism except one thing: that a child may not always require less stimulus. It's the appropriate stimulus. The wolf's heartbeat sounded in his ear, the rise and fall of its breath. The wolf's exhalation generated a deep, subsonic vibration, nearly a purr, but not quite, something lower that echoed in the bones. These were the signals Ethan's nervous system had been looking for, not the buzzing fluorescent lights, clattering lunch plates, and deafening loudness of a world designed by and for neurotypical minds. This. Fur and warmth, and a heartbeat that asked and demanded nothing but repeatedly stated, in a language older than any human speech, "I'm here. I'm here. I'm here." Hours have passed. The storm peaked about 2 a.m., with gusts gusting to 60 miles per hour, visibility plunging to zero, and temperatures reaching 41 degrees below zero. Trees split and fell somewhere in the forest, creating the sound of rifle bullets ringing over the valley. Snow accumulated at a rate of 3 inches per hour, burying everything and transforming the environment into something strange and new. The wolf adjusted. When the wind changed direction, the wolf moved itself to block the new angle. When snow began to collect on Ethan's exposed legs, the wolf used its nose to nudge the boy deeper into the shelter, closer to the fallen tree and away from the open side. When a branch crashed down 10 feet from their position, dumping ice and snow into the depression, the wolf rose to its full height, massive and commanding, its lips pulling back briefly to reveal teeth capable of crushing bone, assessed the threat, determined it was not alive, and lay back down beside the boy without waking him. It was for protection. Pure, instinctive, and unmistakable. A wild animal, an apex predator who had never felt a human touch and had survived alone in one of the most harsh places on the planet, had decided to protect this infant. Not because it had been trained, not because it was tame, not for any reason that science, logic, or common sense could fully explain. Something in those amber eyes had noticed something in the boy's dark gaze, and whatever it was, whatever silent frequency traveled between them in that initial locked stare, it was sufficient, more than enough. When the first grey light of dawn broke through the rain clouds on the second morning, Ethan opened his eyes to see the wolf eyeing him, not with the predator's careful, evaluating stare, not with the blank stare of an animal enduring a temporary hardship, with patience, with presence, with something that appeared impossibly, obviously, sensitive. Ethan reached up to touch the wolf's face. His delicate fingers traced the line of its jaw, then proceeded up the bridge of its nose, stopping at the area between its eyes. The wolf's eyes closed in response to the contact. Its big body exhaled, a long, deep breath that carried away tension Ethan had no idea the animal was harboring. Ethan smiled. It wasn't a large smile. It wasn't the kind of smile that brightens a room or makes strangers stop and look. It was small, quiet, and private. A smile meant only for the creature in front of him. A smile that existed entirely in the present moment, unburdened by the past or future, uncontaminated by the expectations, disappointments, and clinical evaluations that had defined the previous 4 years of his life. It was the most genuine emotion his face has given since he was 7 years old. The wolf opened its eyes. It observed the boy's smile. It pressed its chilly, wet nose into Ethan's palm. That was when Ethan decided to name the wolf. He couldn't say it, not yet, but a word evolved in his head, in the wide, peaceful, endlessly detailed environment where Ethan Mercer spent the most of his existence. It came from somewhere deep, somewhere the doctors had never been able to reach, and somewhere his parents had no idea existed. Siku. He wasn't sure where the word came from. He had no idea that it meant ice in Inupiaq, the language of the people who had inhabited this country for thousands of years before anybody else arrived. He just knew that the word felt perfect, that it matched the wolf's heartbeat as well as his own. Siku. The storm was still raging. His father was still seeking. His mother was still waiting by the phone, which couldn't reach anyone important. And somewhere to the south, a search and rescue team was preparing for what they expected to be a recovery mission rather than a rescue. Nobody expected to discover Ethan Mercer alive. But Ethan Mercer was unconcerned about being found. He was thinking of the wolf beside him, the warmth in its fur, and the word that had flashed across his head like a candle in a dark room. Hope had appeared. But fate had different intentions. The second night would be worse. It was terrible. This situation would test the bond between the child and the wolf in ways neither of them could have imagined. They attempted to kill them the second night. The temperature didn't just drop, it collapsed. It went from -41 degrees to 45 degrees. 45 became 48. The wind created new angles and gaps in the fallen tree shelter, blowing snow horizontally through crevices that had been blocked hours before. The ramshackle roof of spruce branches above them creaked beneath the gathering weight, ice splitting in loud bullet sounds that resonated throughout the darkness. Ethan awoke shivering. This was not the moderate, sporadic shivering from the night before. It was ferocious. Whole body convulsions rattled his teeth and caused his eyesight to waver. His fingers had turned white again, curling into tight fists within his sleeves. His feet were numb, despite the boots and the triple-layered wool socks Sarah had on that morning. Totally numb. The kind of numbness that fades from sensation to absence, as if the feet are no longer present. Siku sensed it. The wolf had been sleeping, or what passes for sleep in a predator, a shallow, half-conscious state in which the body relaxes but the ears never cease functioning. When Ethan's shaking became more intense, the wolf's eyes opened. Amber, alert. The big head rose from where it had been resting on its paws, and the wolf analyzed the situation with the fast, efficient calculation of an animal that knew cold the way a surgeon does anatomy. The youngster was losing heat quicker than the wolf could replenish it. Siku stood. Despite the small confines, the movement was fluid, one moment lying flat, the next on all 4 legs, with snow pouring off its back in sheets. The wolf gently stepped over Ethan, placing itself on the shelter's windward side, with the greatest gaps, pressing its bulk against the apertures like a living wall. Then it lowered itself again, curling closer this time, and drew Ethan into the warm curve of its belly, with a deliberate nudge of its nose against the boy's back. Ethan rolled toward the warmth, instinctively. His body understood what his head couldn't. The wolf represented heat, survival, and the difference between waking up and not waking up. He buried his face in Siku's thick fur, his fists uncurling, and his fingers seeking the warmest spot in the dense undercoat. The shivering continued, but it slowed. His breathing remained steady. But the crisis wasn't cold. It came at 3 in the morning, and Ethan had no idea. It wasn't a sound or the wind, a falling leaf or branch, or any of the forest sounds he'd heard over the previous 36 hours. This was different. A sharp, trembling cry pierced the storm like a razor. It was very close. It was perhaps 15 meters away. Siku's body became hard. Every muscle was locked. The wolf's lips pulled back in stillness, with no growl or warning sound, only the gradual, methodical revealing of teeth that gleamed white in the darkness. Its ears rotated forward, fixing the direction of the sound with surgical accuracy. Its eyes narrowed. Ethan sensed the change right away. The wolf's heartbeat, which had served as his metronome, anchor, and constant rhythm to keep the quiet in his brain from becoming unbearable, accelerated. Hard, fast. A drummer moves from lullaby to battle cadence. The cry came again, closer. Wolverine. Ethan didn't recognize the word, the animal, or the exact threat. But he understood Siku's reaction. The wolf's body was communicating in a language far more eloquent than anything the speech therapists had ever attempted to teach him. Every coiled muscle, every shifted weight, and every controlled breath said the same thing. Danger is here, stay motionless, and stay behind me. Siku arose again. This time there was no fluidity to it. The wolf surged upward, whirling to face the shelter's doorway, putting its full body between Ethan and whatever was outside in the storm. Its head dipped low, its shoulders hunched. A growl finally broke through, not loud, but deep enough to rock the snow beneath them, deep enough that Ethan felt it in his chest. Deep, low, dangerous. Silence. Even the wind seems to hold its breath. 3 seconds. 5. 10. The wolverine roared again, a frantic, ragged sound filled with hunger and anguish, and there was movement at the shelter's edge. A low, dark form scrambled over the fallen trunk, eyes that captured whatever dim light remained and reflected it in 2 flat, yellow discs. Siku lunged. The sound was immense, a boom that Ethan felt in his bones, followed by the heavy, wet crash of 2 bodies meeting. A snowstorm broke out. The fallen tree shelter rocked. There was snarling, flailing, claws scraping across frozen bark, and then a single sharp yelp. Not from Siku, and the black form vanished. Scrambling backward over the tree, slamming through undergrowth, and fleeing into the storm with the desperate, ungraceful pace of a creature who had terribly underestimated its chances. Siku waited at the shelter's edge for quite some time. Its breath formed visible plumes. A tiny line of blood trickled from a scratch above its left eye, leaving a black path in the white fur. Its body did not relax. The muscles remained coiled, the head remained low, the ears continued to scan for 5, 10, or 15 minutes, until whatever scent the wolverine had left behind had been ripped away by the wind, and nothing remained except pure, cold air. The wolf turned back to Ethan. The youngster sat straight, leaning against the far trunk, his eyes wide. Not from fear, his body exhibited none of the shutdown symptoms that terror generally elicits. His respiration was quick, but regulated. His hands were open and not clenched. He was observing Siku, with a look that David, if he had been present, would have recognized right away. The wolf walked back towards him. Slowly now. With each step, the anger drains from its posture, to be replaced by the same unbelievable gentleness. The contrast that made this creature so unusual. An animal capable of confronting a wolverine in a blizzard, and then lowering its blood-stained head to softly nose a child's palm. Ethan reached up to touch the scratch above Siku's eye. His fingers left a small trace of blood. He looked at it, the wolf's blood on his skin, and something stirred behind his eyes. Not in tears, something deeper. A realization that this animal had bled for him. It had placed its body between him and danger without hesitation, calculation, or any expectation of recompense. Ethan pushed his forehead to Siku's forehead. The wolf remained still. Their breath combined in the freezing air between them, blending 2 clouds into one. He could not speak. He couldn't say, "Thank you." He was unable to form the phrases that any other child would have found normal in those situations. But what he could do, what his body knew how to do even when his voice couldn't, was press closer, grip tighter, and let his heartbeat speak for him. "I see you. I trust you. Stay." Siku laid down. Ethan cuddled himself into the wolf's chest. The blood above the wolf's eye had already frozen, sealing the wound. The storm continued to rage. The temperature continued to drop, but nothing else approached them that night. David Mercer, 43 miles south, was having a mental breakdown. The search and rescue team had arrived at the cabin by late afternoon on the first day. 6 men and 2 women from the Kenai Peninsula Borough SAR unit, armed with snowmobiles, thermal imaging equipment, and the quiet, professional grimness of people who had done this before and knew what a missing child in a December blizzard meant. A woman named Margaret Cahill led the crew, 54, former Army medic, 22 years of Alaskan search and rescue. During those years, she discovered 17 people still living. She discovered 43 dead. Margaret told David on the second morning, "The storm is the problem," spreading a topographic map across the cabin table. She did not share the numbers with him, but he could read them in her face. She avoided making promises and spoke in a measured tone. "The visibility is nil. Thermal cameras cannot identify a body heat signature in this type of wind chill. Ground teams cannot move safely in these conditions. Then I'll go alone." "Mr. Mercer, he's my son." Margaret gazed at him. She had heard it before. Every parent mentioned it. Every parent believed that love alone could overcome weather, topography, physics, and biology. Every time, Margaret had to explain why it couldn't. But something in David Mercer's eyes made her stop. Not desperation. She had seen plenty of it. Something steadier. Margaret assured the man, who had lived his entire life in the bush, that he would remain within radio range despite the dangers. "You will carry a GPS beacon, and if I call you back, you return. No arguments." David nodded once. He rushed out the door before she could complete her statement. What would you do in his position? Would you wait for the storm to pass, trusting professionals and the odds? Or would you walk into the white, relying solely on instinct and faith, knowing that every minute your child spends alone in the cold brings them closer to an outcome you can't bear to think about? Nobody could have predicted the implications of that decision, because what David Mercer would discover on the third morning, what he would witness with his own eyes and battle to believe for the rest of his life, was already waiting for him. He only had to get through the night first. David survived the night. He did not sleep. He walked. As time passed, in the humming darkness, the GPS signal flickered like a mechanical heartbeat in his body, the headlights casting a faint yellow tunnel through the snowstorm. Despite being buried under 2 meters of fresh snow, they followed Ethan's first steps to the northwest. He shouted his son's name until his voice was hoarse, then continued walking silently, examining the trees and trying to discern if anything was under the breeze. He found nothing. By the third morning, the storm had begun to subside. Alaskan storms don't just end suddenly, of course. Rather, they take a breath, they calm down. The wind decreased from 60 to 40 and then to 20. The snowstorm transitioned from a solid white wall to scattered flurries. The sky remained gloomy, but the clouds had lifted enough to expose the jagged outline of the Kenai Mountains to the north, their summits buried in fresh snow. At 7:15, Margaret announced over the radio, "Mr. Mercer, the helicopter is being launched." The time frame is narrow, perhaps 3 hours before the next front arrives. Ground teams are mobilizing from the south trailhead. "What is your position?" David checked his GPS. He was 6 miles from the cabin. He crossed 6 miles of hard, pathless terrain in darkness, climbing over deadfall, wading through waist-deep drifts, falling, rising and falling again. His legs were shaky, his face was raw. His left hand's fingers had become numb 2 hours earlier and had not recovered. "Coordinate reference November 7, 426, she informed me. "David, continue north." Margaret used his name for the first time. She was aware of the passage. "You need to grasp the timeline. In these conditions, after 96 hours, the survival rate of a child or anyone, "I know the numbers, Margaret." "Alive," David replied as the radio fell silent. Not a plea. This is not a desperate father's illusion. A declaration of fact, given with the same quiet confidence he used to detect an animal trace. "I do not know how, but he is alive." Margaret did not answer for a long time. When she did, her voice changed, softer, after 22 years of removing dead from the Alaskan tundra. A woman who had heard this similar remark from dozens of parents said, "Keep your beacon on." She understood that faith and survival were not the same thing. "We'll find you first, then sweep north." The helicopter appeared 2 hours later, a red and white AS-350 slicing across the bleak sky like a wound. David heard it before he saw it, the rhythmic chop of the rotors bouncing off the mountainside, distorted by distance and topography. He fired his signal flare. The wind quickly tore apart the orange smoke that climbed through the trees. They spotted him. The helicopter circled once, tilted its nose, and headed north. David followed on the ground. He was very exhausted now. His body had entered that odd realm beyond exhaustion, where movement becomes instinctive, where the legs keep going not because the brain orders them to, but because stopping felt more impossible than continuing. His thoughts had focused to a single point, his son's face, dark, eyes and small hands pressed against the cabin's window, reaching for something only he could see. The helicopter's radio frequency was routed to David's portable unit. He overheard the pilot and spotter speaking in clipped, professional shorthand about grid coordinates, altitude adjustments, and thermal readings. The most of it was negative. The woodland is empty, the clearings are empty. Empty ridgelines stretched towards mountains that didn't care if a boy lived or died. The spotter's voice changed to, "Wait. Hold. I have something." David ceased walking. He tightened his grip on the radio until it groaned. 2 heat signatures. Close together. Very close. Almost overlapping. Grid reference, November 7, 438. In a valley between downed trees, possibly 300 meters north of the frozen creek bed. David's heart thumped into his ribs as he asked, "Size on the signatures?" "One large. One tiny. The large one is... I have no idea what I'm looking at. It's huge. Canine, perhaps. The tiny one is suitable for a child." Before the spotter could finish his statement, David was already sprinting. The GPS indicated that the coordinates were less than a mile away from his current location. A mile of dense woodland, deep snow, and terrain that would take a new hiker 30 minutes under normal conditions. David finished it in 12. He burst through the last spruce wall and ended up in a clearing he'd never seen before. The helicopter hovered overhead, its downdraft blowing snow into a whirlwind that seared his eyes and filled his teeth. Through the white pandemonium, he noticed the depression. 2 big fallen trunks crossed over each other, snow piled against them in steep drifts, and a lone spruce leaning overhead. His son and a white wolf were huddled up between the trunks, having survived 4 days of the biggest winter storm on the Kenai Peninsula in a decade. David's knees buckled. He fell hard in the snow, 20 feet from the shelter, with no words coming from his throat. It was something older than words, a raw, guttural release of 3 days of horror, hope, sleeplessness, and prayer, pulled from his chest like a bandage ripped off a wound. Ethan was alive. The boy was sitting up straight, his red jacket visible through the gap in the fallen trunks, his face pale but attentive, his dark eyes open and fixated on his father, with an expression David couldn't read. Not relieved, not joy. Somewhat quieter. Something that stated, "I was never lost. I was exactly where I should be." The wolf was behind him, crushed against his side, its big white bulk coiled protectively around the youngster, its amber eyes fastened on David with such intensity that he couldn't breathe. David had been photographing wolves for 20 years. He had seen them in every situation: hunting, feeding, playing, fighting, nursing, and mourning. He spent more time watching their behavior than other biologists. He comprehended their body language in the same way a translator does grammar. He had never seen anything like this wolf's position before. The animal was not defensive. Its ears were forward, not pinned back. Its lips remained slack, covering its teeth. Its tail lay flat and not tucked. It was not endangered by David's presence. It was not prepared to fight or run. It was waiting for David to get closer, waiting for the father to contact his son, waiting with the patient in the silence of a guardian whose shift was coming to an end, who realized, in whatever way a wild animal does, that the youngster was going to be returned to his own kind. The wolf gazed at David. David gazed at the wolf. Something passed between them. This wasn't the same frequency that had linked Siku and Ethan. This was one protector acknowledging another. A father saw in those amber eyes the same devotion he felt in his own heart. A similar willingness to bleed. Same refusal to go. David's eyes burned. "Thank you," he muttered. The wolf maintained his gaze for 3 more seconds. Then it blinked slowly and methodically, turning its head toward Ethan. It rubbed its nose against the boy's cheek for the final time. A gesture so sweet, so undeniably compassionate. David felt his heart fracture along a fault line he had no idea existed. Then Siku stood. The wolf stood to its full height, massive against the white backdrop, its fur catching the weak light filtering through the clouds, the thin scar above its left eye a dark line on the white. It carefully stepped over Ethan, like it had done 100 times in the previous 4 days, and moved to the edge of the shelter. It paused there. It turned its head one final time. Those golden eyes discovered Ethan's dark ones, and held. The truth had not evaporated. It had waited, right here, in this cold valley, between a youngster who couldn't talk and a wolf who didn't want him to. Then Siku turned and went into the trees. Ethan watched the wolf leave. His body did not tighten. His face did not crumple. He sat totally still, his hands in his lap, his gaze drawn to the white shape as it traveled through the spruce, shrinking, becoming darker, and disappearing into the forest like smoke into air. The wolf was gone. David crawled forward in the slow. He approached the shelter, reached through the space between the fallen trunks, and grabbed his son in his arms. He could not speak. Ethan could not talk. Neither of them had to. David cradled his son in the snow while the helicopter circled overhead. The rescue team's voices crackled over the radio, and the storm clouds parted just enough to let a single shaft of pale winter light fall across the clearing, like a hand softly resting on a shoulder. But the most essential moment hadn't yet occurred. It was coming, and no one, not David, Margaret, or the paramedics who were already unloading gear from the chopper, was ready for what Ethan Mercer was about to accomplish. The paramedics arrived within minutes. 2 guys moved quickly through the snow with a stretcher and emergency thermal blankets, their faces fixed in the focused, mechanical calm of specialists trained to repress emotion until the work is completed. They checked Ethan's vital signs, heart rate, oxygen levels, and core temperature. They wrapped him in layers of insulated foil which crinkled with each movement. They spoke to him in a quiet, steady tone, explaining what they were doing and asking questions he didn't expect to respond. Ethan did not respond to any of it. He sat immobile on the stretcher, his dark eyes locked on the tree line where Siku had vanished. His body was compliant. He didn't oppose the blankets, the blood pressure cuff, or the penlight the paramedic shone momentarily into each eye. But his mind was elsewhere, completely and entirely elsewhere. David knelt alongside him. He grasped his son's hand between his own and whispered, "You're safe, buddy," despite its small size and coldness. "I've got you." Ethan did not glance at him. Margaret arrived on foot, breathing heavily, her radio crackling with helicopter crew status reports. She came to a halt at the edge of the clearing and took in the scene. The youngster in the fifth stretcher, his father kneeling beside him, and the shelter of fallen trees that had somehow kept a child alive through 4 days of conditions that should have killed him in one. She examined the shelter more closely. Look at the crushed snow inside it. Look at the gigantic paw prints, wolf prints unmistakable, that cover every inch of the depression. At the white fur trapped on the bark of the fallen trunks, which blew in the breeze like little flags. Her mouth opened, closed. She said nothing. The lead paramedic stood up and pulled David aside. The speaker's voice was low, but David understood what he said. He's hypothermic, but it's mild, remarkably mild given the exposure time. There was no frostbite on his extremities, which should have been unthinkable given the temps. His core temperature is 95.2. If he's still alive, he's probably in his 80s. Something kept him warm out here, Mr. Mercer. Something that was not his jacket. David examined the paw prints in the snow. I know what kept him warm. The paramedic followed his gaze. His eyebrows lifted, but he made no reply. He'd been doing this work long enough to know that Alaska occasionally generated stories that did not fit neatly into the lines of medical charts. They prepared to transport Ethan to the chopper. One paramedic stood at each end of the stretcher. David walked beside it, and Margaret led the way through the snow to the area where the AS-350 had landed, its rotors still rotating in slow circles. When Ethan sat up, they were about halfway across the clearing. The movement was sudden. The paramedics halted. David paused. Margaret, 10 paces ahead, turned around. Ethan sat upright on the stretcher, heated blankets slipping from his shoulders. His body was tight, not with the frightened, shut-down rigidity of sensory overload, but with something totally different. David had only seen this once before, 2 days before, at the base of an ancient spruce tree, when a howl resonated over the valley and his kid attempted to answer. Same coiled stillness. The chest expands the same way. The throat muscles act the same way. This time, though, things were different. This time, the machines were not locked. Ethan tipped his head back, his eyes closed. His small chest expanded, filled with cold Alaskan air, 4 days of silence, and everything he had never been able to say to his parents, teachers, therapists, or the endless parade of adults who had talked at, about, and around him for 4 years, without ever hearing the one thing he needed them to understand. And Ethan Mercer howled. The sound splintered the clearing like lightning. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a cry. It was a howl. Long, rising, unrelenting, and pitched with accuracy that no speech therapist or textbook could have foreseen. It rose from his mouth and soared into the grey Alaskan sky, hanging suspended above the snow-covered trees, frozen creek, mountains, and clouds, filling every cubic inch of solitude with a sound that was neither human nor animal, but somewhere in between. Something new. Something had emerged from the space between a boy and a wolf after 4 days of sharing air, warmth, and heartbeats in the dark. Everyone froze. The paramedics stood unmoving, gripping stretcher handles with white-knuckled fists. Margaret's hand moved to her mouth. The helicopter pilot, seen via the cockpit glass, leaned forward in his seat. David Mercer could not move, couldn't breathe, his gaze fixed on. His son, this silent, unreachable boy who hadn't made a voluntary sound in 4 years, and tears flowed. Not slowly, no, not graciously. They arrived in the same manner that floodwater flows over a shattered dam, suddenly, violently, and unstoppable. The howl lasted 7 seconds. Then came quiet. Complete, resounding, heavenly quiet. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. A howl rang out from beyond the tree line, from deep within the icy forest, where a white wolf with a scar over its left eye had been standing immobile among the spruce, watching the clearing and the kid, unwilling to leave. Long, low, rising and descending in a single arc, matching the boy's pitch with such precision that the hair stood up on every arm in the clearing. Siku. The wolf's cry echoed over the valley, wrapping around Ethan like a blanket. The child opened his eyes. His visage, pale and tired from 4 days of cold, wind and impossible survival, had altered. Not with a smile, with something more than a smile. A wholeness, a completeness. the expression of a child who has finally, after years of searching, discovered the language he was born to speak. Ethan turned to face his father. Their gazes met, and for the first time since he was 7 years old, Ethan Mercer's eyes were not separated. No walls. There is no inaccessible space between him and the rest of the world. He stared at his father in the same way he had gazed at the wolf, with presence, recognition, and the complete, unguarded openness of a soul that had finally returned home. David removed his son from the stretcher and held him. He held him in the snow, the cold, the pale Alaskan light, while the wolf's howl faded into the mountains, and the rescue team stood silent, and Margaret Cahill, a woman who had spent 22 years training herself not to cry on the job, pressed her hand to her eyes and let the tears flow. Some bonds do not require words. Some ties are inscribed in a language that predates speech, civilization, and the first person to gaze into the eyes of a wild animal and identify something familiar. Ethan Mercer was transported home that afternoon. He would spend 2 nights in a hospital in Soldotna, where physicians would marvel at his condition but be unable to explain how a non-verbal autistic youngster could survive 4 nights in sub-zero temperatures with only a red jacket and a wild wolf. In the weeks that followed, he would resume speaking, slowly, haltingly, 1 word at a time, beginning with noises that his speech therapist described as unusually tonal, and his father recognized as something altogether different. He would never be the same boy who walked into that gymnasium at 7 p.m. and left mute. The world was always too loud, too bright, and too much. But the stillness within him, the locked, icy silence that had kept him apart from everyone he loved, had been broken. Not by medication, not via treatment, not through any human intervention, by a heartbeat in the darkness, with golden eyes in a blizzard, by a wolf named Siku, who had never been taught compassion but exercised it naturally, just as the winter falls, the rivers freeze, and the northern lights adorn the sky in colors that no human tongue can completely describe. David Mercer returned to the valley the next spring. He went alone, bringing just his camera and a snapshot of Ethan, smiling, actually smiling, which he tucked into the depression between the fallen trees where his son had been discovered. He sat in the clearing for around 3 hours. He did not see the wolf, but as he stood to depart, a howl echoed from somewhere deep in the mountains. Distant, familiar, unmistakable. David closed his eyes, his throat clenched. "Thank you," he muttered once more, "for everything." The howl vanished. The woodland settled. David Mercer walked home. This anecdote tells us that communication isn't limited to words, that the strongest ties are formed not via language, but by presence. The simple, powerful act of being present when someone needs you, without expecting anything in exchange. Ethan Mercer was disappointed by a world that assessed relationship in language, milestones, and clinical benchmarks. He was rescued by a monster that measured time in heartbeats, in warmth, in their willingness to stay. If there is one lesson that the freezing wilderness of Alaska whispered to that boy, and through him to all of us, it is that loyalty knows no species. Love has no language. And sometimes the voice you've been looking for all your life does not come from within you. It's the cry of a white wolf in the snow, beckoning you home. If you were moved by this tale, please share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe animals comprehend us in ways that we cannot explain? Have you ever had a bond that transcended words? Tell me your tale, because stories like this one deserve to be remembered.